Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video on History Valley Podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Nicholas Peter Lee Allen. And today we're going to be discussing his book titled The Jesus Fallacy, A Greatest Lie Ever Told. And that being said, it's good to have you back on the show, Nick. And can you tell everybody what your book, The Jesus Fallacy, is about before I get to my questions?
Sure. I wrote the book because I probably naively thought that perhaps I could assist people in becoming more responsible humans. But I know that is naive, but I still wrote the book because of the state of our planet. And I firmly believe that religious belief at the moment is causing huge problems, and that the majority of our population are unable to think logically and rationally and do not seem to be able to take responsibility for their actions. Often, what's the word I'm looking for here? They fall back on their religious faith, saying that their belief system will save them, that they don't need to personally take responsibility for what's happening. And I could have picked any religion, Islam, Judaism, but because I know more about Christianity, I decided to use Christianity as a model of the kinds of things that people believe in without rational thought. And I'm hoping that if you read the book, it will assist you in understanding the difference between belief and applying a scientific methodology. The book is set out in 9 chapters, and it was written in such a way as to allow somebody who knew very little about the history of Judaism and Christianity to follow logically from about 2900 BCE up to the present day. Once a person has read the book, it can then be used as an encyclopedia where you can dip into it and call up information as you desire. At the moment, as I say, it's 9 chapters. Chapter 2 discusses the essential doctrine of fundamental Christianity as a point of departure. Chapter 3 attempts to justify why we as truth-seeking, intelligent, rational, and critical human beings need to embrace the scientific method. Chapter 4 takes a brief look at other major religions and philosophies, except Judaism, all of which have had a profound influence on Christianity. Chapter 5 deals specifically with the known history of Judaism and its development. Chapter 6 deals with major influences on nascent Christian sects and the various dogmas that were manufactured, culminating with the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed in 381. Chapter 7, I look at all the claimed extra-biblical material that supposedly confirms the historical existence of Jesus. And you may remember that last week we pretty much covered that when we were looking at Josephus. And chapter 8 shows to what extent the New Testament is seriously flawed. It fails as a reliable history book, contains fiction, rhetoric, hyperbole, symbolism, innumerable contradictions, and many false claims regarding prophecy. And I also offer a very short critique of pertinent aspects of Bart Ehrman's excellent book titled Did Jesus Exist? The Historical Argument for Jesus of Nazareth. Finally, in chapter 9, based only on hard evidence contained in this book, I sum up how early Christianity evolved from various forms of Jewish and Hellenistic religious tradition. So we'll leave it there.
And what do we know about Christianity's creed?
Sorry, could you repeat that, Jacob?
So what do we know about Christianity's creed?
Oh, gosh. The fundamentals of Christianity are that we are, as human beings, born into a state which they call sin. This is a concept that we are born with some kind of black mark against us, which cannot be removed. It is a development from the older Jewish concept of avarot, which just meant a, shall we say, a lapse of judgment or a missed archery shot, which is known as chet in Judaism, in Hebrew. And instead of believing that human beings are created by an all-loving deity who lays down laws for them to follow, which is your basic Jewish creed, it believes that we now, in the present, if you like, are unable to shake off this negative quality of sin. And that the deity, because it wants us to have eternal life, and it quotes the what the Christians call the Old Testament, where it's stated that the price of sin is death, and claims that death is caused because of the sin. It promises that this will be removed if we as human beings accept that God himself paid the price for this affliction. And to do this, he had to incarnate as a human being, albeit perfect human being. There's a bit of a contradiction there as well, because a human being has certain natural propensities, and it's difficult to see how one can remove human characteristics and nature and still be left with this idealized concept of a perfect deity. But regardless of that, this deity then is unjustly and unfairly tried while being guiltless and blameless, and therefore the blood that he sheds becomes the atonement for all of human beings' wickedness, both now and in the past and in the future. And that if you believe in this, you will have eternal life. That seems to be the main gist of it.
And how does one head towards or become a rational thinker?
Okay. Well, first of all, if one wants to be scientific, and science is a relatively new approach to understanding knowledge, the Greeks, probably amongst the first peoples to become scientific, and here I can use an example in that before the 5th century, it was very common to explain, if you didn't understand something, you would say that the gods were responsible for it. By the time we get to Greek thinkers like Socrates and Plato and later Aristotle, these thinkers, although they still believed in something divine, they were amongst the first people to try and explain things in a way that did not invoke the deities that they believed in. In other words, trying to find objective solutions to apparent problems. Scientific inquiry itself acquires knowledge by objectively testing the validity or refutability of a hypothesis by means of repeatable experiment and or evidence that stands up to repeated verification. There is no emotion in science. Empirical arguments are contingent on knowledge obtained during objective, unbiased observation or experimentation to corroborate their suppositions. Science requires that any claim be substantiated with hard evidence that may be continually proven by repeatable experiment. And contrary to popular misinformation, science does not claim that it always has the answers. It's a very humble and cautious endeavor if it's practiced in the right hands. So in the bottom line is the rules are simple. If anyone makes a claim, then the onus is on that person to provide irrefutable evidence to hold up that claim under repeatable test conditions. It is not acceptable for someone to make a ridiculous claim and then simply expect everyone else to either accept it or disprove it. Okay, and it's also not satisfactory to assume that any claim must be considered valid until it is disproven. And a very interesting way of looking at this is if all our knowledge disappeared today, imagine every book, all our technology, all our science, and all our religions disappeared today, and human beings continued. Within a few hundred years, religions would be back, but they would be different to what we have now. And when science eventually came back into the human orbit, that science would be identical to what we have today. And that is probably the single most obvious proof that science is not going to be something that's based on a whim or emotional interpretation. Something is either correct or it's not correct based on the evidence that is supplied. Whereas faith, belief, is like the wind. It will change depending on the context.
And how does Christianity parallel other religions like the mysteries of Mithras, the Persian religion, and other religions like that?
Just to clarify, are you asking how religions like the mysteries of Mithras influenced Christianity, or are you more interested in the differences between nascent Christianity and the Mysteria?
The similarities.
The similarities. Okay, that's a really big topic, because Christianity, as it appeared, say, in the 4th century of the Common Era, was already a mishmash of so many other beliefs and ideas. I'm generalizing, but the Hellenistic period, which stretches from, say, 100 BCE up to 100 CE, was a melting point of ideas, especially in Rome. And what's very amusing is that when Christianity gained hegemony in the Roman Empire, a lot of the church leaders, like Irenaeus, for example, and I'm thinking here of Tertullianus, who was a famous convert to Christianity, they suddenly realized that some of the things that were considered unique to Christianity, Christians often think that their religion is unique and that there's nothing quite like it. And these church fathers and early apologists of the church realized that other religions had almost exactly the same rituals. And in the case of the mysteries of Mithras, Irenaeus was very, very disgruntled to discover that the members of the mysteries of Mithras had a Eucharist where they drank wine and ate bread and had rituals that were exactly the same as what happened in the early church. And to explain why they preceded the Christians with these ideas, they argued that the devil had deliberately allowed these earlier religions to practice these proto-Christian ideas so that they could basically insult the deity, the Christian deity, at a later stage, that it was a kind of a wicked plot to undermine the truth of Christianity. Tertullian also writes on this issue about baptism. He's offended that the followers of the mysteries of Mithras baptized, and I mean, most religions, if not all religions at that time, baptized. And when I say baptized, I'm talking about the immersion of a human being into water to either symbolize or actually effect a change of personality, a rebirth into a new belief system. And as I said last week when I spoke to you, Origenus believed that anybody who went through Christian baptism would have a personality change and become Christ-like. If they were wicked people before, they were now pure and would continue to be so. And other religions had similar ideas, this sort of sympathetic magic belief that being submerged in a body of water and then coming out of it not only symbolized a kind of a rebirth, a dying and coming back into the light, it was also an effective way of changing one's outlook. And the followers of the mysteries of Mithras clearly did this. And as I say, Tertullian was offended, and he blamed Satan for them having had the same idea as the Christians before them. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
No, that's good. And can you talk about the part when you discuss what is supposedly the sober-minded historian?
Sorry, just say that again. The sober-minded historian.
Yes.
Well, to me, the word sober-minded, I link it to applying the scientific method, if that makes sense. I mean, I'm speaking very generally here, but as I did indicate earlier, historians in the ancient world did not use history the way we use history today. I'm especially referring to Hellenistic authors here, where through rhetoric and clever narratological skills, they would try to convince their reader of the truth of what they were saying, regardless of whether it was true or not. It was more about a case of convincing somebody to believe what they were saying. And as I mentioned earlier with you, authors like Luke would use the guise of being an historian to enforce the validity of what they were saying as a backdrop. Whereas a modern historian is trying to understand, what really happened in the past, which is quite a tall order, let me assure you. In fact, it's one of the great paradoxes for me personally, because as an historian, I realize that I'm trying to recover something from the past which is gone. The past doesn't exist anymore. There is no past. All we have are marks on stone, words on pieces of paper. And of course, in more recent times, we have film and recordings of people speaking, and we have artifacts like coinage. But when you're dealing with something that happened, say, 3,000 years ago, we're not so privileged. And so when one writes about the past and tries to grasp what happened in the past, one realizes that however scientific one is trying to be, the very act of writing a sentence in a book to explain objectively what one has found out with good evidence can itself be misconstrued. It could be misread. There's the whole problem of interpretation. The choice of words that one uses can alter the way something is listened to and and digested by the audience or the reader. So at the end of the day, speaking for myself personally, I have to rely on my integrity, aware of my failings, because I'm using language which is already flawed, trying to recover a past which is no longer here. But despite that, I will religiously, if I can use that word, use the scientific method, because it's the best method we have. And just to give you an example, sometimes we don't just use one methodology to find out about something. We use a triangulation of methodologies. If I can give you one example that might help the audience here. If you were trying to date a Dead Sea Scroll, as an example, you would get a paleographer to look at the text. And the paleographer would say, oh, based on the style of writing, this is probably 1st century BCE. And then you could carbon date a piece of the papyrus, and carbon dating would come back and say, oh, this is sometime between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE. And then another person might come along and say, well, based on the content, what's written in the document, the person is talking about something when the temple still existed, for example. So therefore, it was written before 70 CE. And so you would then have 3 pieces of information. And you would then look at those 3 pieces of information and say, they suggest that this item comes from a period between, say, the 2nd century and the beginning of the 1st century. And you would do that with that evidence that you've got from the triangulation of methodologies. And that is about as best we can do. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. But I do have another question to add to that. When you look at Christian apologists and those that are called the sober-minded scholar for believing in a historical Jesus, that's what I was talking. That's what I was originally trying to ask about.
Okay.
You talk about that in the Jesus fallacy.
Yes, of course. I think most people do not separate the possible flesh and blood individual or individuals who gave rise to the myth. The myth starts, I would say, late 1st century and becomes ossified by the 4th century. The Christological myth, what you ended up with, the literalistic dogma, which is the foundation of modern Christianity. The Jesus described in the Gospels is a construct. And naive people try to then see that as a description of a real person. And so it was popular for people who were trying to be, as you were using the word, more sober-minded, to try to reconstruct what this Jesus of history actually looked like. We call them this interest in the historicity, the historical Jesus. And the problem here for me is that very often people conflate the truth value of the religion with the existence of the individual. And last time we spoke, I mentioned an analogy here is that if I prove that Thales lived in the 6th century BCE, that doesn't necessarily mean that earthquakes are formed by the earth floating on water. And the same goes for Jesus. If Jesus actually lived and existed, it doesn't really validate the belief system, because the belief system evolved from whatever happened. And as I have shown in this book, it evolved not necessarily from a flesh and blood person, but more likely it evolved from other religions and other belief systems. So we must be careful not to conflate information. The people who are interested in historical Jesus, purely trying to understand what a real Yeshua ben Yosef would have looked like and what he would have believed in the first century, that is a different project to the one that I'm involved with, because first of all, we have absolutely no information about that hypothetical person or persons. All we have is the myth. All we have are the stories, the folk tales, the exaggerated accounts, fantastical accounts, in fact, of what happened in the first century, or we're assuming happened in the first century. So we have to be very careful. And I must be careful here. I'm not saying that Jesus didn't exist. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that we do not conflate the Jesus of the Gospels with the possible flesh and blood personal persons who may have influenced some of those stories. What is far more important to me are the ideas that informed Christianity, where they came from. And those are quite ancient in many cases. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Can you tell us about the evolution of Judaism and Christianity?
Sure, that is a very long topic. Okay. Can you see the screen okay, Jacob?
Yes, I can.
Okay. What I've put there is a typical conservative fundamentalist view of how Judaism came about. You have the Adam and Eve story. The earth is only 6,000 years old. We have the flood narrative. We have the Tower of Babel. And then about 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, we have Abraham, who, according to the conservatives, was speaking Hebrew, which is actually quite impossible. And then we have the Exodus story. And then we have the united monarchy between the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, which is also open to debate. And then we have the destruction of Israel and the survival of Judah. And ultimately, we have the Babylonian captivity. Those are like the highlights of the conservative view. Now, in reality, the Canaanites have been around since probably, could go back as far as 8,000 BCE, but in terms of a culture that looks very similar to what we would imagine early Israelites enjoyed, you'd have to go back to about 2,900 BCE, okay, to the land of Canaan. And we know factually that people from the land of Canaan moved into Egypt around about 1650 BCE. And they created a capital at Avaris. And we call this period the Second Intermediate Period. The native Egyptians still had a king who was based in Thebes, and we had a division, if you like, in the Egyptian territory. We know that in 1570 onwards, the very first king of the New Kingdom, a guy called Ahmose, rose to power, and to cut a long story short, after a number of battles, he eventually got rid of the Hyksos people, as they were called, these Canaanites, and ultimately he kicked them out of Avaris and chased them back into Canaan. And that then marks the beginning of the New Kingdom. According to reports by people in the 3rd century BCE, a certain person of 3rd century BCE, he claims that these people who fled Egypt arrived in what is now Jerusalem in the 7th century BCE and founded Jerusalem. That is the story. I don't know how much of that can be taken at face value, but Ahmose definitely existed, and we know from other inscriptions that Ahmose definitely chased the Canaanites out of Egypt. Now this raises an interesting point. From 1479 BC onwards, we have the reign of Thutmose III, who's a slightly later New Kingdom pharaoh, or should actually still call him a king. He's not a pharaoh yet. And as you can see on the map, Thutmose III owns not only Egypt, but he also owns all the land that belongs to the Canaanites, including the Phoenician cities on the west coast there, on the east side of the Mediterranean. And the Hittite Empire in the north is in competition with the Egyptians. And you can see that around Kochemish, for example, in the north, there is a dispute there going on between the Hittites and the Egyptians. Which means that if you want to believe that Moses, for example, had an exodus sometime between the 1500s and the 1200s BCE, he would have been running into Egypt, not out of Egypt. So there's a big problem. It also is important to know that for at least 300, if not 400 years, the people who called themselves Canaanites were living under Egyptian control and even modeled themselves on the Egyptians. The first major battle against them was at Megiddo. And the last major battle which the Egyptians lost was at Jaffa. If you look at the Canaanite kingdoms and territories that existed in the latter part of that period, just after the withdrawal of Egyptian control, you can see that the kingdom of Israel is based there on places like Samaria and Shechem. The kingdom of Judah is based on Jerusalem. We have the kingdom of Aram Damascus, the kingdom of Ammon, the kingdom of Moab, Edom, and then we have some newcomers, the Sea Peoples who invaded. We're not sure where they came from, but they started the Philistine city-states in what is now called Gaza. And in the north, you have the Phoenicians. That is pretty much the situation. Now I'm jumping ahead because we're talking about the introduction of religions. If you look at Canaan culture as a whole, El was the main deity. El has a long history. It goes back to about 2900 BCE, and he took as a consort Asherah, who was originally a Hittite deity, and she was a goddess of creation. She was very powerful. She actually made stuff like El did, El and Asherah. We believe that El is based on a desert wind, a hot desert wind. You will also notice that some of the Sumerian deities gave rise to deities which eventually started to influence the Canaanites. So we have Marduk, who is probably one of the most powerful ancient Near Eastern deities. And he had an offspring called Nabu, and Nabu was borrowed by the Canaanites. You will also see that there is Yahu on the left, Dagon, Hadad, Baal, Milcom, Kos, and Chemosh. They are all creator deities. And each one of them is related to a particular nationality within the Canaanite district. Yahu is the odd one out, because Yahoo seems to have been imported from the Sinai region, which I'll talk about a bit later. What is interesting for our discussion about Judaism is Asherah was taken over by the Israelites and became the consort of Yahoo, which we now call Yahweh. We also know that Yahweh, being a deity that seems to have come from the Sinai region, was originally a very minor deity. There's increasing evidence that he may have been related to metallurgy, the smelting of copper, bronze, and gold. And there we're looking at the Timnah Valley in Ekron. And on the left are actual bronze serpents related to the worship of Yahweh that have been discovered. And as you can see, they're very old. They date from 1350 to 1250 BCE, which is before the kingdom of Israel was even conceived. Vestiges of this belief linger in the Bible, because we have the story of Moses, for example, who was worried about the children of Israel, the Bnei Yisrael, being bitten by snakes, and he made them worship a bronze snake on a pole to save them from snakebite poisoning. And this is so out of, order in terms of what the Moses story is trying to communicate, because it's moving away from the story of the covenant. It's almost advocating another deity for the children of Israel to worship. But as you can see, it fits in well with the idea that perhaps originally Yahweh was a bronze deity. Interestingly enough, when you pour bronze out of a crucible, it makes a snake-like flow in the sand, and that may have been where they got the idea from. And to really rub it in, there's something like 234 deities that were worshipped by the Canaanite cultures between 1450 and 500 BCE. And on the screen, I've shown you just 76 of them. In the blue square, we have the gods, and in the pink, we have the goddesses. And you can see that Yahweh is not alone initially. He's one of many deities. He just eventually became the supreme deity, the chief deity for the Israelites in the kingdom of Israel. And also, I suspect, for the kingdom of Judah as well. And we call this monolatrism. In other words, you have a divine council of deities, and the CEO, if you like, the CEO of the board is Yahweh. And he sits at the head of the table. So he is a primary object of worship, but he's not the only one. The original temple, the so-called Solomon's temple, if you read what Josiah did in the 600s, it says that he removed the cult objects of Asherah and the cosmic deities from the temple and burnt them, which means that in the 900s, that temple of Solomon didn't just contain the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh, it also contained cult objects of all the other deities that were part of the divine council. And of course, that might be quite shocking to some people who believe that the early Jews were monotheistic. They were not. And here are some actual remains, artifacts of some of these deities. This one here comes from northern Israel, dates to between 1400 and 1200, and it's either Baal or El. And on this note, I must just mention Baal was a deity in his own right, but eventually the word Baal came to mean Lord. So a lot of the deities have the title Baal in their name. And El who was also a supreme deity, eventually the word El just came to mean God. And that is why in the Bible, you'll often see words like Elyon, or the word El as a therapic name. For example, Emmanuel or Daniel or Michael, Gabriel, for example. So the name of God is incorporated into the name, a theophoric name. So El doesn't mean the God El anymore. It refers to Yahweh as a title in later times. And we know that some of these sculptures must have been life-size, which also shows us that there was no problem with making graven images either. These two images here show you the scepter that would have been held by El or Baal in his hand. And here's an image of Baal, and here is an image of Asherah, the creator goddess. Now that's just the beginning. We have, well, not me, but just recently, they've discovered in a site called Kuntilet Ajrud, which is between Sinai and Egypt. They have found water jars which date to roughly 800 BCE. Now, 800 BCE, the kingdom of Israel existed by then, and maybe the kingdom of Judah by then. Not likely, but possibly. And these water jars have got images and inscriptions on them invoking Yahweh, El, and Baal. Very interesting. And two of them have the phrase Yahweh of Samaria, which means that's Israel, and his Asherah. In other words, Yahweh and Asherah are equal. They are a couple. And they even mention of having a covenant with Asherah, which is fascinating because it's not just a covenant with Yahweh, it's also with his consort. Now, what happened then is we suspect is that Asherah was phased out. She became less important from about 800 onwards, but she still featured. We know that she was around during the reign of Hezekiah, and he ended his reign in 686 BCE, and she may have been actively promoted in the reign of Manasseh, and he reigned right up to 642. And as I mentioned earlier, King Josiah is recorded in the Bible as destroying her cult objects sometime between 641 and 609 BCE. So that seems to be the time when she was completely phased out. Now, at the same time that is happening, we've also got the Neo-Assyrian Empire increasing its hegemony in the region. And so the kingdoms of Aram, Israel, Judah, etc., that I showed you on the map previously, from the 8th century onwards, they are basically under Neo-Assyrian domination. And I'm not going to bore you with details, but by 721, Shalmaneser V, the king of Assyria, captured this territory of Samaria and forced the inhabitants of the northern kingdom of Israel into captivity. And then he introduced foreign settlers from other parts of the Neo-Assyrian territory and put them into the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, that was a typical weapon of war of the Neo-Assyrians. They took people out of their comfort zone and moved them somewhere else in the empire. And that's very clever because that stops you having pressure groups within your empire. It allows you to control things. And another thing the Neo-Assyrians did, which will probably be news to some of your viewers, is that they introduced a form of Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of the time. It was used to aid trade and communication. So all the peoples in Canaan spoke it. It was technically a language of oppression because they had no choice. And originally, this language was written in cuneiform. This is before Phoenician text was borrowed and became Paleo-Hebrew. And Hebrew itself developed from Aramaic. So the idea that God created the cosmos in Hebrew is kind of blown out of the water here, because it wasn't even a Canaanite language to start with. It was introduced by the Neo-Assyrians and then adopted. By 701 BCE, the king of Neo-Assyria, Sennacherib, assailed the kingdom of Judah and destroyed Lachish. He also went on to destroy Babylon. And Judah basically remained under Neo-Assyrian control for the next 100 years. Judahites, because the Israelites don't exist anymore, the Judahites endured under the continued threat of Neo-Assyrian cultural assimilation. And the Judahites became a vassal kingdom, as simple as that. And they were only released from Neo-Assyrian subjugation in 612 BCE, when the Neo-Babylonians came on the scene, and the Neo-Babylonians basically replaced the Neo-Assyrians. So now the Judahites, instead of being under the yoke of the Neo-Assyrians, are now under the yoke of the Neo-Babylonians. Now the story becomes very interesting, because the Neo-Babylonians also used the system of deportation to control their conquered territories. And they took a number of elite Judahites from Judah or Judea, and they moved them to other parts of Babylonia, including Babylon itself. These people were not really slaves in Babylon. They were subjugated initially, but they eventually owned homes and businesses. They played a role in administration. And when the opportunity came for the Jews, and I should rather call them Judeans or Judahites, had the chance to come home to Jerusalem, many of them were not really that interested, because they had a much better life in Babylonia and Babylon. Now that brings us on to another very interesting issue. The Neo-Babylonians were then removed by the Achaemenid Persians. And here we're talking about Cyrus the Great, who, according to the stories that have come down to us, was magnanimous and allowed the Jews to return to Judah. He also started the process of them rebuilding their temple. Now, I'm going to have to do this very quickly, because there's a lot of information here. When I can't really go into great detail, it would take us hours. But the bottom line is that the Achaemenid Persians were Zoroastrians. Specifically, they belonged to a heterodox branch of Zoroastrianism called Zurvanism. And I'm not going to bore you with the difference between these two groups, except to say that Zurvanism believed that there was a deity of benevolence and omnipotence, that he was holy, that he had a twin brother, if you like. The good deity was called Ahura Mazda, and the bad deity, the flip side, was called Angra Mainyu. And whatever Ahura Mazda made and created, Angra Mainyu tried to destroy. And originally the Iranians, the Persians, had been a polytheistic people, exactly like the Canaanites. And they shall we say, devalued a number of their previous deities, like Mitra and other deities, and turned them into, for want of a better word, angels. I'm using here the wrong term, but it's the term that most people will understand. The Zoroastrians call them Yazatas, but it's like an angel. It's a divine being, but not as powerful as Ahura Mazda. And the belief was that the good old deities became Yazatas, and I'm simplifying this, the bad ones became demons. And the demons supported Angra Mainyu, and the good ones supported Ahura Mazda. And under the heterodox belief of Zurvanism, Angra Mainyu and Ahura Mazda were equal in power, absolutely identical. And it was believed that they had been created by time itself, infinite time. A very interesting concept, because people were obviously asking, how can you have a deity that suddenly has evil, which is a problem with Judaism as interpreted by Christians, because to the Jews, Yahweh was all goodness. There is no evil. But from a Christian perspective, there's the devil. How do you get a devil? Because if the deity made the devil, then the deity made evil, and that causes problems, theological problems. The Zurvanists got around that by saying infinite time created positive and negative forces, if you like, equally, which sounds a little bit similar to what people are saying now about how we get from a void to a multiverse, but that's another topic. So they had purity laws, and Nehemiah, who's in the Bible, is a prophet. He was the cupbearer of one of the Zurvanist kings, one of the Achaemenid Persian kings. If you are a cupbearer for a Zurvanist king, it means that you yourself would have to adhere to the holiness laws of the Zurvanites. There's just no two ways about it. And yet Nehemiah, we know now, was probably responsible for pushing the issue that Yahweh should be worshipped alone. In other words, he was trying to push the worship of Yahweh as the only national deity of the Judahites. And that idea would have come from Zurvanism itself. We also know that the Achaemenid Persian kings responsible at that time paid money to assist with the building of the temple in Jerusalem. And one of the Achaemenid Persian kings even refers to Yahweh as the God of Jerusalem. And he approved of the God of Jerusalem. And that is really interesting, because it means that the Zoroastrians, or the Zurvanists, saw Yahweh as being, if you like, on sides with their own belief system. And that is incredible. That means there's a link between these two religions. And what is fascinating here is that Zurvanism, or its earlier form Zoroastrianism, and this early nascent Judaism had similar backgrounds. They both started as polytheistic belief systems. They both went through a monolatrist phase. They both ended up becoming national religions, one of the Iranians and the other of the Judahites, and they both ended up conceiving of an international deity whose power went beyond boundaries, went beyond the boundaries of their nations that they've been created in. So there are fascinating links between these two religions. But back to Judaism. So we can say that Judaism proper seems to start around about 500 to 400 BCE. And that's really when many of the books of the Bible start to coalesce. Some of those writings are much older, obviously, but they were redacted. For example, Malachi lived in the 7th century. Isaiah lived probably in the 7th, 6th century. They obviously wrote stuff down, but the ideas changed and altered to suit the growing theology. They were redacted. We know that Asherah must have been removed from some of the texts because she was no longer acceptable. And the story ends up with there just being Yahweh alone. And in fact, we call Nehemiah's input is the creation of the Yahweh alonist cult, if you like. So we have a new temple, and this time it is only for Yahweh. We have purity laws coming into Judaism. We have the returning exiles from Babylonia who, whilst in exile, started to practice certain, shall we say, rituals and rites which identified them as being different to the other cultures, exactly like Zoroastrians do to this day. The one is dietary, because that also sets you apart. Circumcision, which sets you apart. Saying prayers directed towards Jerusalem. Keeping separate, not allowing marriage outside of the community. And these get inculcated into the new purity laws, and Judaism proper, as I call it now, really starts. It's also the rise of the priesthood. Remember, they don't have kings anymore. The priests become more powerful. The priests are the ones who start redacting the biblical text. They start controlling what will go into those texts. And just to show you what happened there, if we take an older folktale, like say the Exodus story, Moses is using a sanctuary weight a few hundred years before the temple was built. So you must ask yourself, how did he have a sanctuary weight if there was no sanctuary? And that's because the priests wrote the story and they simply put it in because they had a sanctuary. And there are other examples that you can find if you have the eyes to see them. To cut a long story short, by the time we get to Hellenistic times, let's say around about 100 BCE, most of the books that you associate with the Old Testament were in place. Not all of them, but most of them. We also know that from the 3rd century onwards, there was a major change in theology amongst believing Jews. I can now use the word Jew, which represents somebody who follows Torah teaching absolutely, who follows purity laws, obeys the mitzvot. Those Jews had, up until the 3rd century, tended to take the line that if they were in any way wicked or practicing iniquity, they could obviously return to God, to their God, through a process called teshuvah, which means to return. It's really a process where you admit your faults, where you promise not to do them again, and then you are basically clean. Okay, if I want to use a Christian term here, you don't have any more sin. And that's why I don't like using the word sin, because Jews don't believe in sin in the same way that Christians do. So the iniquity is removed through the process of teshuvah. But there's also a leitmotif that runs through a lot of biblical texts. Isaiah is a very good example, where the excuse is given that when the Neo-Assyrians destroyed Israel, it was because Yahweh was angry. He was punishing the Israelites for their blasphemy and their iniquity. And the story is always the same. Some king starts to practice idolatry. Yahweh gets upset. He uses the enemies of the Judahites or the Israelites to punish them. Then he accepts that he forgives them and welcomes them back to his bosom. And then he punishes the very people that he chose in the first place to punish the Israelites or Judahites. That's the leitmotif. And it runs right through a lot of the biblical passages. You just have to read Isaiah from end to end and you will see that plot repeated. You can imagine that people who've been oppressed since the 8th century, first the Neo-Assyrians, then the Neo-Babylonians, then the Achaemenid Persians, then you have the Seleucids, then you have the Ptolemaic period, you have a brief respite with the Hasmonean dynasty, and then you've got the Romans oppressing them. The Judahites never really had a period, except from the Hasmonean period, where they had their own rule. They were always oppressed, always a vassal state of some powerful foreign empire. And by the 3rd century, one gets the impression that they are tired of using the excuse that Yahweh is angry with them, because they know that they have done everything right. They have kept to the purity laws. They have done everything correctly, and yet they're still being punished. So they started to question what was happening. And new ideas start to creep into the theology. The idea that perhaps these are the last days. Maybe Yahweh has a plan. He's going to punish the enemies of the Jews. There will be some cataclysmic event, the end of time. Again, based on Zoroastrianism, because the Zoroastrians also believe that. They believe in a fiery hell at the end of time, where the bad people will be thrown into a fiery pit and destroyed. We have this interesting situation where movements like the Essene community started to say things like, well, maybe we need a second covenant with Yahweh. We need a new covenant with him. We are the true followers of the covenant. We're not like the other Jews who are blasphemers and irreligious and don't do things correctly. We are the correct ones. They also start to claim that Yahweh is omniscient and has always known what was going to happen, that he basically planned everything right down to the last detail, and that if you are not a member of the Essene community, it was planned from the beginning of time itself. They also come up with a very interesting statement of faith, which again seems to be based on Zoroastrianism. They claim that in the beginning of time, Yahweh created two spirits, one evil and one good, and that human beings are afflicted with these two spirits, and that we can either listen to like the spirit of evil or the spirit of good. This is the first time that we see the attempt to personify evil, because normative Judaism doesn't believe in an entity of evil. There's only goodness, there's only Yahweh, there's only God. There's no devil, there's no anti-God in the process. And now we have the claim made that God himself made an evil spirit and a good spirit. That's really interesting stuff. We also have the Sadducee movement, which tended to be more literal and listen to the word, the written Torah. In many ways, Sadducees were closer to normative Judaism as it had been. And then we have another interesting group, the Pharisees, who were another offshoot, who, very similar to the Essenes, believed that God was very similar to fate, that death was not final, that there was an afterlife. This is all new stuff, that good people would go to heaven and have eternal life, that bad people would be punished in the afterlife. This is all new. And that happens from about the 3rd century onwards, and it becomes more and more intense. We see a lot more apocalyptic writing, suggestions that the end of time is coming, that a new kingdom is coming. And this is the climate, if you like, that in a way, sets the scene for aspects of what eventually will become known as Christianity, but we're still not there yet. So I am generalizing here, but it's very difficult to talk about so much information in such a short time. If you want details, read the book. It goes into more detail than what I'm saying now. Jacob, do you want me to stop there, or do you want me to say something about early Christianity?
Go ahead and talk about the evolution of Christianity. Yeah.
Okay. Zoroastrianism continued to evolve, and we are pretty sure that aspects of it influenced early Christians as well. Judaism is also normally accepted as being the only influence on Christianity. It's not. In fact, if I talk about normative Judaism and I talk about normative Christianity, they are antithetical to each other. They don't even belong in the same room as each other. To try to explain, and I have to generalize again, because Judaism has been through all sorts of twists and turns and different sects and different beliefs, and I would be very arrogant to try and sum it all up in one sentence. So you will have to allow me to be a generalist here. So normative Judaism would claim that there's only God and he's all goodness, that humans are born with a pure soul, that we are given free will, and that we can either listen to the teachings, the Torah, or we can work against them. We can work against them maybe out of ignorance, accidentally, or deliberately. But there's always, if I can use the Christian term, salvation, because you can go back. You can have teshuvah. You can return to the deity at any time. Eventually, there were some exceptions made to that. For example, idolatry, incest, adultery were put forward as being reasons for a person being executed. In other words, death was the penalty for those. But considering that in the Torah there is no mention of afterlife, normative Judaism did not prescribe survival after death anyway. I'm not saying that Jews didn't believe in it. I'm sure privately people may have hoped for it, but it's not prescribed. The attitude is that you're given a life. Your rewards are in the here and now, if you look at normative Judaism. The Torah clearly says that if you obey the commandments, your fields will receive rain. You'll live a long time. You'll see your great-grandchildren. Your seed will continue into perpetuity. The underlying principle is that if you die with a good name, your name lives on. That was the kind of the emphasis on the here and now. Very physical. And death was always considered a punishment for disobedience at a very high level, if I can put it like that. Christianity teaches that God created ultimately an imperfect cosmos, that even though he has an imperfect cosmos, he expects his creation to be perfect. It's really contradictory. We're told that God is omniscient, omnipotent, that he's all goodness, that he's eternal. And yet, if we're going to take the folk tale of Adam and Eve seriously, which is the very story that's used to indicate why we all have to now suffer with permanent iniquity, or sin as it's called, it's because God, for some reason, even though he's omniscient, didn't realize that Adam and Eve were going to disobey him. Now that doesn't even begin to make sense. I know it's only a folk tale, but if you take it literally, and conservative fundamentalists do, then it's contradictory. it also highlights a deity who's actually a megalomaniac, because he creates something which he knows is not going to work, and then wants to punish his creation. Imagine I'm a potter, and I try to make a Ming vase, and I make a flat ashtray, and then I punish the ashtray by chopping it up into little pieces. But meanwhile, the person who made the ashtray was me. I'm the one who needs to be punished, if anybody. So the stories are contradictory, because they're misunderstandings of their import when they were written. They've been taken literally. That's what we call literalist Christianity, which is the most recent manifestation of it, because there were earlier examples of Christianity which were more Gnostic and more metaphorical. So we have a situation where the deity now has to commit suicide in order to pay this blood debt. Again, blood now comes into it. The blood now becomes the metaphor of a sacrifice that's being made by the deity. That this perfect being is now bled out in order to make sure that all the human beings who believe this will not die. But again, there's a contradiction. You still got to die before you go to this paradisical state. So obviously it doesn't work immediately. Now, the early Christians, although they took aspects of Judaism, which they misinterpreted totally, they were also influenced by other ideas. I think most important is, the Egyptian ideas, pharaonic ideas, but I would like to look at specifically the ideas of people like Plato and Plotinus, because they are, as far as I'm concerned, they are really they're the initiators of certain concepts which are now part and parcel of modern Christianity. Now, to understand Greek thought, I have to just go back a little bit and explain that to the Greeks, the world, the natural world, the world that is, the world that is always present, the world that we can do nothing about, was called physis. That's where we get our word physics from, physis. The cosmos is physis. And anything that we can do about it, in other words, our ideas, our beliefs, our laws, is called nomos, which means laws, basically. And I want to quickly, just because this is really a good opportunity to show you a picture, I'm going to show you an image. I just hope that this... Okay. So I'm hoping that you can see the screen there. And what I've done is I've borrowed a very nice representation of Plato's allegory of the cave to explain his philosophy. And this philosophy is going to influence Christianity hugely. In the image, you can see that there's a cave under the ground. That represents the world of appearances, or nomos, which is, in other words, the human condition, what the humans do, what we talk about, what we think, our laws, our concepts. And then beyond our comprehension and invisible to us, on the upper level, is the world of forms. Plato called it the world of forms, the divine forms, because Plato believed in divinity. He believed in some kind of mystical divine force beyond our comprehension. The divine forms include geometric forms, like circles and squares and triangles and pentagons, etc. According to Plato, we are trapped. We are sitting in a dark place. The sun, if you like, is shining in on us, and it hits these objects which are being held up by society, and it creates shadow images on the wall. And so the reality that we see around us is but a reflection or a shadow of what is happening at a higher level. We will never be able to understand the world of divine forms. We can only see the pale shadow of it on the earth. The earth is a place of fallenness. It's dark, it's materialistic. This is also Gnostic ideas, which I'll talk about later if we have time. The idea that there's a division between, if you like, the world of light and the world of darkness. And we are in ignorance in our darkness, thinking that we understand things, when in fact we're being beguiled by the shadow images that we see whilst we're on earth. To explain this a little bit better, imagine a circle. Everybody knows what a circle is, but nobody can make a perfect circle. And that might sound like a strange claim, but nobody can make a perfect circle. Certainly not while you're on Earth. If you take a pair of compasses and you draw a circle on a piece of paper, you might argue that you have created a perfect circle, but you haven't. If you look at that circle under a microscope, it is nothing but lumps of carbon scattered over the surface of fibers. It is irregular in shape. Yet, we all know what a perfect circle is. All of us would agree that technically there is a concept of the perfect circle. And Plato would argue, yes, that perfect circle exists in the realm of divine forms, physis. We can't actually see a perfect circle, but we can make circles that are more or less perfect. But unfortunately, they are pale reflections of the true circle. And in the same way that geometric forms exist in physis, the divine forms, he would also argue there's a perfect cat, there's a perfect dog, there's a perfect human being. And he also talked about the possibility of there being a perfect soul. In other words, he anticipated that there were all sorts of, what could I call them, divine forms in existence, which presupposed anything that we could see on the planet. And even further, because you could imagine something without having actually seen it, it proved to him that the world of divine forms was superior to the world of appearances. You didn't even need the world of appearances to contemplate a divine form. You could do it in your head. You could conceive of it through intellect, through rigorous philosophy and critical thinking. So in the picture, you see the sun is represented as a fire because it's a physical object and therefore it's in the world of nomos. It itself is but a pale reflection of the divine form of the sun, which we cannot see. The physical sun casts shadows on the wall, which we're looking at, and we think that that is reality. Society prescribes the things that we must believe in, whether it's religion, politics, ideas, what can I think of? Nationalities. Okay. And then you have somebody who now decides that they're not going to look at those shadows. They're going to start studying philosophy. They're going to start thinking critically. And on the top right, we have somebody who's starting that hard, arduous journey to get to the truth. And that person is doing critical thinking. They still haven't worked it out yet, but they're trying really hard. And ultimately, only the philosopher who stands at the top is able to really understand what's going on. So this is a very, very useful allegory, which which Plato used to explain this concept. Now, we call Plato a Platonist, and there were many other Platonists like him, and one of them was a guy called Plotinus. Plotinus, in a sense, anticipated something that we now call Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism is, in fact, the direct influence on Christianity, early Christianity. So he argued for the existence of the one or the source. In other words, he wanted to say that if you're going to believe in divine forms and the belief that there's a divine realm, then there has to be something there that's beyond our comprehension. And this is really a form of Gnosticism. The idea that there's a monad, I like to say an entity that's even greater than your concept of a God. Something totally beyond your comprehension. And this one, this monad, has always existed. Okay? Which sort of anticipates the church, who said that their God has always existed. He was begotten. They use the word begotten. Not created, he's begotten. Or he was his own cause. In other words, he caused himself. And the concept of the good with a capital G and the one are the same. So the one, this monad, is perfect. He's omnibenevolent, he's omnipresent, he's totally self-sufficient, he's self-evidently true. And he cannot be conceived by human intellect. Now, of course, here I have a good laugh, because Plotinus is actually telling you that he is conceiving of this. Now, if you can't conceive of it, well, then why is he conceiving of it? But anyway, we have to appreciate his attempt here. Plotinus says that the one is perfect, seeking nothing, possessing nothing, lacking nothing. Plotinus says that the one is without form, indeterminate, limitless, and infinite. If you try to understand the one as existing, you would limit it, if that makes sense. To even talk about it is to limit it, because it's beyond all comprehension. Okay, so now this one, this monad, is often referred to as a divine mind. And mind is the realm of true being, or what the Greeks called nous. Nous is explained as being the highest echelon of the true self. Thus, in theory, the first level of reality is knowable for the correctly trained or prepared individual. However, it must have been difficult to achieve this status, since from an earlier Platonic perspective, this would be a sphere where physis and nomos would have to coincide. That's an interesting concept, a seemingly impossible condition where the ideal form of a particular individual and his or her appearance in nomos were one and the same. That's quite a thought. To get around the problem, Plotinus expanded on Plato's world of archetypes or forms. He argued that the one is unknowable but still responsible for the existence of divine mind, and thus universal nous. Now, these ideas are going to influence Christianity. A little allegory that might explain what's going on here better is, imagine the sun has rays, and we are the rays. And so by looking at us as rays, we can understand an aspect of the sun. But we do not understand the sun because it's beyond our comprehension. Right. The most important thing that he came up with is a thing called a hypostasis. A hypostasis here is the merging, if you like, of the divine and the material, the physis with the nomos. And that word hypostasis is going to be used by the first Christians to explain how they understand the Godhead. Okay, so maybe leave it there, but we probably need to go on and actually talk about, I'm just thinking aloud here, the early Christians and what they actually believed. Okay, the first thing that we have to understand is that there wasn't just one type of Christianity by the 4th century. Between 100 and 325 of the Common Era, and beyond that actually, there were loads of different types of Christians. And they were not all literal Christians like we see today. They were more spiritual, shall we say, and more Gnostic. Let me start with the Gnostics. Again, here, I think what I'm going to do, sorry, I have to find my cursor to get to my PowerPoint. I'm going to share the screen. Okay, this is just a picture. Can you see it, I hope?
Yes, I can.
Okay, cool. Now, I'm going to have a delimitation here. I am not in any way claiming this is the only way to look at Gnosticism. I must be very clear. This is a simplistic diagram designed to teach somebody who knows nothing about the topic the basics, because it can become very complicated. And I've already been speaking about Plato and Plotinus, and when I've explained Gnosticism, you will immediately see the similarities between their ideas and these Gnostic ideas. And Gnosticism is a big influence on Christianity. Okay, so there are many versions of this, many ideas, very similar, and many different religions have picked up on this. The basic idea is that you have a realm of evil. And this is very interesting. The idea that evil is somehow connected with the material world. This is a very, very interesting concept, because even now people still have this idea that if something is made of matter, it must be bad, that it's not spiritual, that it's wicked. And this is exactly the idea. The demiurge, as it was called, is this world of darkness. I've indicated in red here. It's a world where the supreme, shall we say, creator, if you can even use that word, within this realm, makes stuff, makes more stuff which you don't want. And some of the Gnostics even believed that Yahweh was the supreme embodiment of evil, because he made stuff. He made the earth, he made the universe, he made the cosmos. Therefore, he's evil, if you can believe this, okay? And within the demiurge are a load of very wicked beings called archons. And depending on which group you're dealing with, sometimes there's 7 archons, sometimes there are 12. I won't go into details. But they are responsible for all the bad things that happen in the world. And we poor human beings, we are stuck here. And let me use the word heilig is Greek for material, matter. Okay. Now, there's another realm, the realm of the pleroma. This is very similar to Plotinus's perfect one, the one who's beyond our comprehension and who cannot be envisaged, who's without form, who's limitless, the monad. As I said, in terms of modern belief in a deity, even a supreme deity, the monad is much higher as a concept. The monad is like the sun. It's a good analogy, and he gives off emanations like rays. And the highest one is the Father. There's also a mother, and there are loads of them, and one is also called the Christ. And the lowest emanation, the least important one, is wisdom, which of course is a very clever way of showing you how amazing the monad is. The monad is just beyond comprehension, whereas wisdom, the highest thing we seek as human beings, is its lowest emanation. Now, in some forms of Gnosticism, the Christ emanation is an intercessor. It's the emanation that allows us to move from darkness and materialism through spiritual knowledge, which is gnosis. That's where the word Gnosticism comes from. And we are not in the pleroma yet. We're kind of between the two states. And then we are called a pneumatic, which comes from the Greek for spirit. All right, so we become a pneumatic. And only a pneumatic, I presume in the next life, will actually be one with the monad. Some versions of this have us all trying to become Christs, where the Christ is the perfect self. So we all have our perfect selves that we're all striving for, and all of us would then be a Christ, which would also be between these two worlds. And of course, this idea influenced early Christianity. Remember, Jesus wasn't called the Christ, okay, originally. He started off his career in the myth as an inspired teacher. And it took a few hundred years. He moved from being an inspired teacher to becoming God himself. So in this particular setup, we have already this idea that we're fallen, that we're evil, we're sinful, and we need the intercession of a Christ emanation from the monad to enter into the pleroma. Okay, so that's sorry, I'm just trying to find the switch off button. For some reason, I can't see my cursor. Okay, there we are. Okay, so Gnosticism, I hope I've explained to some point. Then you've got adoptionism. Adoptionism taught that there was only one indivisible supreme deity. They totally reject the idea of there being a trinity, as modern Christians believe. They believed that God, as a supreme being, adopted a human male to serve his divine purposes. That's why it's called adoptionism. Now, depending on the teaching in question, this adoption either took place when Jesus was baptized or after his resurrection. Some people believe it only happened when he ascended into heaven. Then we have one of the most important branches of Christianity, one which survived Constantine, but was increasingly victimized by the literalist Christians, and that is Arianism. It was a doctrine formed by a Christian presbyter called Arius, and he died in the early 4th century. He taught that God the Father was begotten, which is what the Catholic Church today uses to explain how God came into being, and that his first creation was Christ as the Logos. And only after he had made the Christ as the Logos, he could then use the Logos to make everything else. Because of this, the Logos, or Christ, was subservient to the Father. This means that Jesus, as Son, was subservient to the Christian God as Father. And of course, as you can see, it's based on Gnostic ideas, because here you have a monad emanating a ray of Christ, which is lesser. The Council of Nicaea in 325 declared it a heresy. And before the Council of Nicaea, this and other cults, Christian cults and sects, were all allowed to exist. But after the council, it was declared a heresy, and of course, then they started becoming victims of persecution. Needless to say, it survived until the 7th century in one form or another. Then we have Docetism, a very early form of Christianity, 1st century. It dealt with the theological problem of believing in a Jesus who's both God and man, but still sinless. They knew that being in any way human meant you had to be sinful, because don't forget, the dogma is that we are born, if I can borrow a modern word, genetically with sin. It's part of our makeup as humans. So how could Jesus claim to be sinless if he was incarnate? Because the very act of being incarnate meant that he was sinful. Again, we see Gnostic ideas creeping in here, because matter is bad, spirit is good, according to these beliefs. Knowing that being in any way human would cause sin, the Docetists theorized that Jesus as God was obviously never a real human being. Being God, Jesus could never have been associated in any way with sinful flesh. Jesus must have been a sort of a phantom. He looked human, but he had no human weaknesses and no sin. Okay, so that's a very interesting version of Christianity. Marcionism, which is based on the teachings of Marcion of Sinope, 2nd century, was basically Gnostic. Here, the Christian God was the Gnostic monad of light and truth, and he sent a spiritual entity, Jesus, into the physical and sinful world. They denied Jesus' humanity, and they also denied that Jesus was in any way related to the Jewish concept of the Messiah. And Marcionism split up into many, many smaller groups. We have Monarchianism, very influential in the late 2nd and 3rd centuries. They rejected the notion that an indivisible God could be triune. In other words, they didn't accept the Trinity, and they denied the Trinity. Montanism, based on the teachings of Montanus, 2nd century, they believed that the age of prophecy was not over. This is another interesting concept. Many Christians, and in fact also some Jews, believe that the prophecies that you see in the Tanakh, or the Old Testament as the Christians call it, happened at a time when that was possible. And now people can't be prophets anymore. And the Montanists said, no, prophecy is still available. Through the power of the Holy Ghost, as he was then called, prophetic revelations continued to occur. And they were aspects of Christian God's ongoing revelation. And the other Christians didn't like the idea that a Montanist might well claim a divinely revealed proclamation that countermanded something that might have previously been taught in Scripture. You can see the problem here. Although versions of the sect survived until the 6th century, it was declared a heresy in the 3rd century. Sabellianism, based on the teachings of a priest called Sabellius in the 3rd century, they also rejected the Trinity. And those are probably the most important groups that were around in the early 3 or 4 centuries. I think let's leave it there. What I will just quickly say is that the literist Christians who won, shall we say, the debate at the Council of Nicaea in 325, they adopted Plotinus's ideas and said that there was a relationship between humans and God which reflected the hypostasis that I spoke about earlier. And they believed in a Trinity where there were 3 persons of the divinity. That's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, as they called it in those days, now called the Holy Spirit. But the personality of the 3 persons was identical. And of course, people who questioned this were simply told it's a mystery and you must just accept it. Most Christians today accept the Trinity as a fact, even though it's not mentioned in the Bible at all. It's a construct based on interpreting what's been found in the New Testament and then very pointedly influenced by Plotinus and the Neoplatonists, which you should see that as quite obvious from what I've said, plus aspects of Gnosticism. So let's leave it there. I've done a lot of talking, and as I say, I must apologize. I have to generalize because there's too much information to talk about specifics.
The final thing I'd like to cover before we close is the chapter in your book when you talk about pious fraud.
Yes, we spoke about that last week quite a bit. The bottom line is that when the early church fathers, who had just simply assumed that what was written in the New Testament was some kind of factual history, they never questioned the factual history as they perceived it. And when between the 2nd and the 4th century, I would say is the most interesting period. We have people like Celsus, who we know wrote against Christianity. In fact, just as a bit of fun, let me quickly, I just want to talk to you about a guy called Apollonius of Tyana. One of the early Greek philosophers was a guy called Pythagoras, or people now call him Pythagoras, who also had a very Gnostic type understanding of how the cosmos worked. And one of his followers, who actually lived at about the same time as Jesus of Nazareth, he was born in about 3 BCE, whereas Jesus was probably born, the historical Jesus, if he lived, would have been born about 6 BCE. But he lived right up to the end of the 1st century. And let me just tell you something about him. and I'm sure you're going to start smiling. He was a wandering divine man who is recorded as having undertaken the following actions. Being a neo-Pythagorean, he only ate dried fruits and vegetables. He drank wine, but in moderation. He walked barefoot, and he wore a long linen robe. He grew his hair as long as he could. He briefly took a vow of silence. He debated with and corrected the priests of Apollo. He selected 7 disciples. He knew all languages. He was acknowledged as being divine. He claimed to be immortal. He prophesied and divined. He exorcised demons. He healed the lame. He healed various diseases. He restored sight to the blind. He cured a rabid dog and a rabid boy. He identified a vampire. He pacified a troubled satyr. He resurrected the dead. He preached a form of communism. He made witty and ironic aphorisms. He rebuked false religionists and deluded worshippers. He drove out false religionists. He spoke on behalf of the supreme deity. He was judged by the Roman Emperor Domitian for sedition and found innocent. He communed with his disciples after his death, and he had an ascension into heaven. Okay, so there is an example of somebody living at the same time as Jesus of Nazareth who had almost exactly the same CV, all right, curriculum vitae. So Celsus wrote and said, you know, Christianity is just another one of these new religions. It's making these really ridiculous claims that Jesus is divine. I mean, look at Apollonius. Apollonius of Tyana was also divine. And we don't believe, you know, we don't worship him anymore. So why must we believe you Christians? So Celsus, the book that Celsus wrote is no longer available to us. We suspect it was destroyed. But based on what Origenus says, we know more or less what Celsus must have claimed. And it is exactly this kind of attack on the early church by disbelievers and people who are trying to come from a more rational perspective that suddenly forced the church fathers and apologists to start looking at history to try and find extra biblical evidence for what the Bible or the New Testament proclaimed. And they very quickly found that there isn't anything. And so what do you do? What do you do if you believe totally and devoutly in what you're doing? You believe that everybody has to become a Christian, otherwise they're all going to go to hell. You realize that you have a mission to get out there and save as many people as you can. Your religion demands it of you. You know what you're saying is the truth. For some reason, the history books have forgotten to mention Jesus. What do? Well, you make it up. Because you're not really committing, you're not doing anything bad, because you know that what you do, you know that you're right. I mean, no, you're not going to question that. You're absolutely correct. So therefore, to make up stuff that you know actually happened isn't really cheating, is it? It can be justified. And as I mentioned to you last week, Eusebius basically admits this in one of his texts, because the need to save somebody's soul is more important than telling them a little white lie. But the humorous part for me is just how much pious fraud there was. I mean, as I said, fake letters written by Pontius Pilate. I mean, texts which claim that they suddenly realized the error of their ways and realized that they had crucified the Messiah. Tiberius trying to get the Senate to convert. The interpolations that exist in the writings of Josephus in Antiquities. um, the need to embellish traditions which are not biblical to make them sound more plausible. I have a very interesting text which was written by one of the church fathers describing what happened to Judas. And it is so fantastical that you want to weep crying with laughter. It is so hilarious from a modern perspective. It talks about how Judas's genitalia swelled up to the point where he couldn't get through a doorway. All right, that kind of stuff. Really ridiculous. Trying to emphasize what a bad chap he was. Excuses that were made to justify why Jews should be victimized, for example. And also not only trying to defend the validity of the New Testament's pseudo-historical claims, but also to justify why it was okay once Christianity had been established as the official religion of the Roman Empire, why it was now okay to go and terrorize and oppress people who were not Christian, especially Jews, of course. Let's just take one famous person, St. Augustine. Many of you should know that St. Augustine is a doctor of the Catholic Church. There are 4 doctors of the Catholic Church. They are responsible for creating the basic dogmas which the early church adhered to. This great church father wrote critical, inflammatory texts solely designed to purge Christendom of people like Donatists and Arians and other Christians who didn't agree with the literal Christianity which had succeeded. Augustine, who lived between the mid-4th century and the early 5th century, argued that Jesus's little hissy fit in the temple, where he whipped the wicked Jewish moneylenders and turned over the tables, gave Christians the moral authority and divine mandate to take drastic measures against anyone who they believed was a heretic. Augustine also said that he could see the hand of the Christian God in history. From Augustine's perspective, it was plainly obvious why Christianity was now dominant. After all, the Christian God must have masterfully planned everything from the start. Again, I'm reminded here of the claim made by the church fathers that it was necessary for God to allow the early Christians to be martyred. That was how he managed to bring about total Christian domination. It was the Christian God, according to Augustine, who allowed Constantine I to rescue and promote Christianity, which of course is a lie, because he only promoted Christianity because he saw it as a useful way of controlling the empire. His own personal beliefs, he didn't believe in Christianity. He was a follower of Soli Invictus. Most importantly, with the exception, of course, of Diocletian, the Roman emperors were now the perceived champions of the supreme deity's holy word. The emperors were to be compared to the biblical kings of Israel and had a responsibility given to them by God himself to rid the empire of heathen practices and immorality. Aggressive and merciless doctrines were to make an important impact on the horrors that were to follow in the next 1,000 years or so. And that is thanks to Augustine. Again, that to me is also the extreme, if you like, of pious fraud, where you justify whatever you can. Well, you use whatever tools are necessary to justify your actions. So let me leave it there.
So, Nicholas, what do you think caused the rise in the belief of Jesus' resurrection?
Okay, that's quite a difficult question to answer because it depends on the period. But if you're talking about the nascent Christian church, it has a lot to do with the needs of the people. How can I put this? They. If we look at the end, if we look at the apocalyptic period in Jewish history, the post-temple period, they were quite distraught. They didn't feel that they had any future. They had very little hope. And the promise of some kind of afterlife, some kind of paradisical status after life was a very desirable phenomenon to achieve. And so believing that this originally wisdom teacher had now actually died and had risen from the dead and was now able to give them eternal life as well was a very powerful concept. And if we go back to Egyptian times, we see a similar thing with the belief in Osiris. I mean, Osiris, let me just step back a bit and say that when the deity resurrects, it's not just simply a case of getting the flu and getting well. To make it more meaningful to people, the deity has to undergo some kind of traumatic, stressful demise. And if I use Osiris as the model here, I mean, he didn't just die, he was chopped up into little pieces by his evil brother Sekhmet, and then his pieces were scattered all over Egypt. His wife consort had to pick them up, reassemble them, make a mummy, and then she had sexual relations with this mummy to produce Horus. Now that is very, very, very powerful iconography or symbolism, because he's not just dead, he's very dead. And the fact that he resurrects and then promises afterlife to his followers is more meaningful, because people believe, well, if the deity can resurrect under such stressful and impossibly difficult conditions, it's obviously going to be very easy for me. And the story of Christ's crucifixion fits into that model very, very well, in that he doesn't just die, he is subjected to a most shameful public execution, torturous, extreme pain, as I say, humiliation on a grand scale. He's treated as according to the New Testament description, he's treated almost like a criminal. Also the sense of unfairness that this man is perfect, guiltless, without blame, and then manages to endure this and then rise again, is a very powerful message. And if somebody is wanting to ensure that they're going to have an afterlife, what better deity to follow because of that powerful symbolism? I hope that touches on the issue.
I think it does. What can we know about the historical Paul's conversion to Christianity and his encounter with different Christian leaders like Cephas and James?
Okay, that's also quite a loaded question, because we must remember we don't really know much about what actually happened. All we have are snippets of information from the New Testament. And given that the New Testament was constructed to convert people and act as a didactic text, any opinion we may have about that period is subject to massive revision. So I'm only going to give you a very general answer to that. What we are led to believe is that at the time of early Christian development, the nascent Christians, there was a Jewish group of early Christians. Whether they were in fact Jews practicing Judaism and they just assumed that Jesus was a teacher of wisdom, or whether they had gone to the next level where Jesus was now being accepted as a deity, which is a very different situation. I'm not quite sure, but the facts are that the Jewish group would have been circumcised. The males would have been circumcised, and they would have been living according to the laws of Moses. They would have been kashrut. They would have had dietary laws, etc. And if they were in fellowship with a bunch of Gentiles, non-Jewish, early nascent Christians, and I'm deliberately calling them nascent Christians because Christianity had no unifying dogma yet. We're still dealing with disparate groups of people with very different beliefs and very different books that they're reading. They would have not wanted to mix with them because they would have felt that they were, in fact, the term that was used at that time was seeker after smooth things. It was just too easy to become part of this group if you didn't embrace the full Jewish system of obeying the laws of Moses, of being kashrut and being circumcised. And the impression we get is that James, who is put forward as being the surviving brother of Jesus himself, was leading a very Jewish group who adhered to these strict conventions. Whereas Paul, in his desire to convert people, wanted everybody to benefit from accepting Jesus into their life as their savior. And he wanted to make it easier for them. He didn't want them to have to go through this process of having to be circumcised and suddenly embracing dietary laws from another culture. And it seems that there may have been a bit of a tension between some of these early Christian groups, between the ones that were advocating a maintenance of the Jewish system and those who maintained that it was open to everybody. And here we see that Peter seems to play, most people's opinion is that he plays a bridging role between these two groups. That Peter, I suppose, was more diplomatic, whereas Paul was aggressively saying everybody has the right to conversion, and the Jewish group was saying there are limitations. There was even a suggestion that the early Christians who were of Gentile stock were told that they only needed to obey the Noahite laws. This is a concept that the laws that were applicable to Noah, the 7 laws of Noah, were good enough for them, whereas the Jewish converts had to adhere to the full range of mitzvot which a Jew would subscribe to. There's also some doubt as to whether the Peter mentioned in the Gospels is the same as the Cephas that's mentioned in the Gospels. There are 2 schools of thought on this. One is that it's the same person, and the other is that Cephas is distinctly different to Peter. And depending on which version you are going to adhere to, you will have a slightly different interpretation of those events. The other thing that's quite important is that Paul makes it very clear he never met Jesus as an historical person. He never met him physically. There is definitely something very Gnostic about Paul's Christianity. It's almost, I'm pushing the point here, it's almost as though he sees Jesus as purely a spiritual entity. He doesn't talk about Jesus's home life or his family or his upbringing as the other disciples might have done. He sees it, as I say, more on a spiritual level. And another thing he emphasizes is that Jesus has died
the crucifixion, and that he has risen again. So he's preaching a risen Christ as an intercessor. This is where it becomes very Gnostic, that Jesus has come to resolve, if you like, the problem of the world, which is sinful and in chaos, and Christ has come to redeem mankind. That seems to be Paul's message, and it has, say, a very distinctly Gnostic undertone, which is not unusual because a lot of the early Christians had very strong Gnostic links. Whereas the James party were probably more literal, following Torah and the law. And you remember that if you read the New Testament, Paul says that Jesus or Christ, as now a deity, came to move beyond the law, to change the law, to replace the law. So this is a new theology to make a clear break with the Jewish aspects. And in that sense, it's Paul makes, if you like, early Christianity more Roman. It's a more Roman belief. And in many ways, I think that established Judaism is definitely a Roman system rather than a Jewish system. I hope that answers your question.
It does. How did Aristotle contribute to the understanding of the cosmos? And did it at all influence Christianity's understanding of the cosmos?
Yes, okay. I'll tell you what, with your indulgence, I am going to share my screen.
All right.
And I'm going to give you a PowerPoint. It'll be much easier to explain. I don't know. Can you see the screen?
Not yet.
Okay, so we need to do something.
You go to present, share screen, select the exact window you want to share, but click share.
Allow. Okay.
I see it now.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes, I can.
You can see that now, right?
Yes.
Okay. So remember, Aristotle is a student of Plato. And
1 second before you continue, can you hide that little icon on the top there? You are yeah. No, don't click on that. Click on the yeah. There you go.
Okay,
Continue.
sorry about that.
You're fine.
Aristotle was a student of Plato, and as I explained last time we met, he understood. He embraced some of Plato's ideas, especially about the concept that there was a higher order. I don't want to use the word divine here because Aristotle, in fact, was probably the most scientific of many of these earlier philosophers, that he tried very hard to leave gods and deities out of his explanations. But he certainly believed that there was some, shall we say, unknowable source, something beyond our comprehension that was responsible for what we experienced here on Earth. And the Greeks divided their understanding of the world between physis, which is the, using Plato's words, the divine world of forms, and then the world of nomos, which is the earth-bound human dimension, where we make laws and we have opinions and we pass judgment on what we see, which of course means that we are living in an illusion, that we're not really aware of the real world, the real universe. Plato said it's possible to be aware of that universe through thinking, through philosophy, through critical awareness. And Aristotle was very much aware of the need to be a critical person. And he came up with this concept called, which he actually wrote a book called Peri Uranon, which means basically concerning the cosmos. And he saw the cosmos as being a perfect construct which consisted of 55 celestial crystalline spheres which only moved in one direction because they were beyond the constraints of the Earth. The Earth was the center of this universe, and everything revolved around the Earth. And he believed that there was only one Earth in the entire universe because obviously everything depended on this one Earth. If you had another Earth, that would mess up his system. The Earth itself is a place of decay. It's a place of fallenness. It's a place of illusion. And it's a place where we have fire, water, earth, air. And these things change. These things are mutable. But the stars and the planets and the sun and the moon, he believed, were made of ether, which is something which could only exist in this perfect state. He believed that on Earth, things could move in 6 directions, up, down, back, front, left, right. But in the celestial sphere, everything moved in one direction. He believed that the stars were fixed, and they were on the outer sphere. And I can just quickly put a little label on that. So you've got the fixed stars on your outer sphere. Then you have Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Moon, and the Earth being the center. And these spheres are actually quite complicated. In this diagram, you can only see, how many can you see there? About 8 of them. But, sorry, 7 of them. But according to Aristotle, there are 55 spheres because these spheres work on different axes. And they are different time periods for each rotation. And by a combination of these rotations, it would explain what they observed, the movement of planets, for example, which, don't forget, from a Greek perspective, looked like stars. They were just bright lights. They didn't know what they looked like. They didn't know that Saturn had rings, for example. To them, they were just moving points of light. Aristotle believed that these points of light were much bigger than the Earth. And he also, as a matter of interest, he based his theories on an earlier astronomer, well, he lived just a few years before him, and that was Eudoxus of Cnidus. Eudoxus came up with the original idea, and Aristotle perfected it with his understanding of Platonic system. And then what's very interesting here, you asked how this affected Christianity. Well, very shortly after this, we have a very, very smart man called Aristarchus of Samos, who decided that the system didn't work, and he put the sun in the center and moved the Earth and the Moon into the spheres, the spheres that dealt with the planets. And in so doing, he anticipated Copernicus, who is not going to come onto the scene until the 15th century of our common era. This is a major step forward in understanding how our cosmos works. And yet, once the church had been established, after the Nicene Creed in 325, so of the Common Era, and the formation of the Catholic Church, and then the canonization of the New Testament in 380 of the Common Era, and eventually, of course, the complete hegemony of the Church in Western Europe, these ideas were basically silenced, went underground, because they went back to looking at Scripture to determine what the truth was. So it's actually a huge step backwards in terms of the evolution of science. What Christianity did was that it basically stultified the progress that had been made up until that time. And they went back to Aristotle and his terracentric cosmos, which, as I say, dominated the scientific arena and right up until Nicholas Copernicus. And you will remember that when Nicholas Copernicus came up with this theory, it did not receive favorable attention from the church, and Galileo, who supported it, was even subjected to the threat of torture if he did not recant. So you can see that this had a huge influence on what people were allowed to think thereafter. Okay, I hope that I'm back on screen.
Yeah, you are.
Okay, super.
Can you tell us about Plotinus's The One? Who exactly is that?
Okay, maybe I should go back to my
You can share screen again.
yeah, here we go.
Let me know when the presentation's on full screen.
Okay. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah.
Super. Okay, last time we spoke, I put up this very generalized diagram of how Gnosticism works. And I mentioned that there were these two realms, one, the pleroma, which is the realm of light, and then you have the demiurge, which is the realm of darkness. It is very dualistic, and it's strongly based on the Platonic system, which I mentioned, where Earth, where we live here, is a place of change, of decay, of transformation, flux, where people age, die, where we live in an illusion. Whereas the higher levels, what Plato would call the world of forms, is where you have the pure concepts, the good, the truth, the light. And early Christians who were very enamored with the Gnostic principles saw that the monad to them was higher than just God. To them, the monad was, using Plotinus's ideas, was unknowable. It was beyond comprehension. And what I've done here, just to help, is to give you an idea of just how ineffable the monad was in concept. The monad refers to his oneness and its absoluteness. And that means that if you try to describe it, if you try to, you say the monad is infinite, the very act of calling it infinite would lessen it. To try to give it any qualities would be to detract from it. It is beyond human comprehension. Had many, many names. In Greek, it was called the Ion Telios, means the perfect Eon. It was called Bithos, which signifies concepts of being very, very deep and profound. Proarche, before the beginning. And also the idea that it was somehow gave birth to everything that came afterwards, like a parent. The idea, the allegory, or shall we say the metaphor that I would like to use here is that the monad could be likened to the sun, in that you could not look upon it. You'd be blind if you did. But you could understand it in terms of the rays that came out of it. It had emanations. And a lot of the early Christian Gnostics who wrote about this, I'm thinking of people like Valentius and Marconius, people like that, they used the word emanation and it would emanate what they believed, they called them aeons. And if you want to give that a modern spin, an aeon was eventually likened to an angel, an angelic form. But remember that an aeon has no form. It's beyond our comprehension. It's a concept. And the very first aeon, according to Valentius, and I must remind you that there are different versions of Gnosticism, and it's very dangerous to generalize. But if I use Valentius as an example, they use a concept called barbello, which is a hermaphroditic aeon. It's both male and female. And what's very amusing for me is this is very similar to the ancient Egyptians trying to explain how the universe was conceived from chaos, because to them they believed that the deity that did this had to be before male and female were even thought of. So they often used to conceive of their deities as being, the creator deity as being hermaphroditic, male, female, or a male mating with its shadow, or somebody spitting. And in many ways, the trying to explain how these aeons came into being from the monad is very similar. The barbello was a male-female entity, and once it had been produced, it was lesser than the monad. The monad is pure. The monad is beyond comprehension. And as the aeons are produced, each set of aeons produces another set of aeons. And as each layer is being produced, it becomes less and less perfect. So, if we use just one possibility here, the Gnostic Christians would refer to the anoia, which means thought, thinking, and then there'd be another aspect of the aeon called nous, which is your mind. And so each aeon had a split personality between these two poles, if you like. And they were the aeons themselves were, according to one system, were produced in couplets, in pairs, male and female. And so every male aeon had a female counterpart, and vice versa. So the monad is unknowable, because somebody was asking, what is the monad? The monad is beyond comprehension. And according to some of the Gnostics, higher than God, because God is made by the monad, if you like. And then it speaks to absolute perfection. And then as it emanates these various aeons, it moves towards the earthly, towards the material. And then we have knowledge and imperfection. That's what happens when you get to the earthly state. In other words, the darkness, the antithesis of this light. Now, the barbello, who starts off the process, creates different aeons, who create more and more aeons, and in some systems, as many as 30 aeons. And the lowest aeon is Sophia, which is wisdom. And according to some of the early Gnostic Christians, Sophia caused a problem. There are many reasons why she caused this problem, and it gets very technical, but she ultimately caused an issue which resulted in the creation of the demiurge. And because of that, because of this upset in the system, and there are many explanations for this upset, this imbalance, she ended up creating a system which itself started to produce a creator god, which some people liken to Yahweh, the Jewish deity, who also created anti-aeons, if you like. Anti-aeons, which are like demons, if you want to use that expression. And they're called archons. And from a Christian perspective, a Gnostic Christian perspective, the problem here was to get humans who are now trapped in this terrestrial darkness, this place of fallenness, to get them back into the light, to get them back into perfection. And that's where the Christ aeon comes into power. Christ, in some systems, because they are different systems, and in one system, Christ, or Jesus Christ, is the partner aeon to Sophia. And his job is to rectify the mess that Sophia made on the planet. And only by spiritual knowledge, which is gnosis, by gaining spiritual gnosis, can you regain your spiritual qualities to get back into the pleroma. And so if I go back to this diagram, you can see that Christ is one of the aeons. He comes down to earth in a physical form. He has to incarnate. Again, depending on which group you're talking about, this can be interpreted in many different ways. In some systems, he's merely a phantom. In some systems, he is an actual human being. But regardless, he has to come and intercede between the demiurge, which is chaotic and evil and wicked and materialistic, and the upper level, which is light, perfection, and truth, reflecting, of course, going back to Plato's good, the good. And we as humans living in the demiurge, we can be hylic, which means we're material. We could be sarclic, which means we're very fleshly. And the highest level is pneumatic. That means that we're spiritual. And only the pneumatics would be able to be redeemed, according to the Gnostic system. And Gnostic Christianity was very strong in the 1st century. It started to die out at the end of the 2nd century, and ultimately it was declared a heresy by the literalist Christians. After 325, it was outlawed. There are various types of Gnostic systems. Some are still alive today, but they're not Christian. There are groups that went east to the Asian world, and they are in fact groups of Gnostics who have actually survived to this very day, but they're not Christian. The Christian Gnosticism unfortunately died by the 3rd or 4th century. So we leave it there. What other questions do you have there, Jacob?
So Plotinus's theology resembles Gnosticism, basically, right?
You're talking about Plotinus now.
Yeah.
Plotinus was not a Christian. Remember, he's considered to be the father of Neoplatonism, and he follows Plato very, very closely. But where Plotinus is very interesting is that he realized that there was a problem with the Platonic system. Because if you, and I'm being very general here, but if you just take Plato's system as he produced it, it's thinking and critical awareness that allow you to get into the to access the realm of the divine forms. But from a spiritual point of view, Plotinus found it very difficult to understand how is it that if your soul comes from the monad, from the divine, why is it fallen? Why does it need to be saved? Why does it need to be redeemed? And he came up with concepts where he tried to, if you like, have a blend, a hybrid between the two systems, where you could exist, if you like, between the two systems. That you had the divine soul, but because you were in the material world, you still needed to be elevated to the higher realms. And some of those ideas, and there are many versions of these ideas, attracted early Christians. They and especially when we come to the debates at Nicaea in 325, many of the debates about the nature of God, for example, how did God, how was God, if you like, constructed? They borrowed Plotinus's ideas and Christianized them. So, for example, in one Christian Gnostic group, the Holy Spirit was considered to be the spiritual aspect of the monad, and the Christ was supposed to be the material aspect. This is just one view. I'm not saying it was the only view. So that's the split in the aeon between the Christ and the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit, for example, in Christianity, Christ is portrayed as having gone back to heaven after his death and resurrection, and then he says, "I'll send you the Holy Spirit to console you, to give you compassion in my absence." And that was borrowed from the Gnostics. That idea was borrowed from the Gnostics, and then became a Christian idea. But then it became literal. And that's the difference between Gnosticism and literal Christianity, is that literal Christianity has dogmas where you have to believe something absolutely factually, whereas Gnosticism is a far more open, symbolic system. It's more metaphorical, if I can say that. Does that help?
Yes, it does. So was the early Christian movement, or really I'm asking, were the first Christians Gnostic?
Okay, there's a lot of problems here. Because we don't have enough information, there are different schools of thought. Some people are quite adamant that Gnosticism predates Christianity by quite some time, and that there were Gnostic movements in Persia, for example, before Christians got hold of it. Other people believe that Gnosticism is simply an aspect of early Christianity. Regardless, considering that the early world, you must remember, I'm generalizing here, but from about 100 BCE up to about, say, 150 CE, the Roman world, the Roman Greek world, is a melting pot of ideas. In Rome, in fact, Rome should be viewed as a crucible. It's filled with people from all over the world with very dynamic ideas and views. You've got all sorts of religions being practiced simultaneously. You've got Mysteria from the Greek world. You've got Judaism being practiced. You've got syncretist religions like the worship of Serapis, the worship of Isis. You've got the movements from Alexandria, where the Ptolemies are desperately trying to produce a religion that will unify the native Egyptians with the Greek oppressors, because the Greeks are the upper class and they're basically oppressing the lower classes there, who are the Greek native, the native Egyptian peoples. And on that point, remember, Cleopatra VII was the first Ptolemy to actually be able to read hieroglyphs. Up until that time, nobody even bothered to try to understand Egyptian culture that they were in charge of. And so a syncretist belief like the worship of Serapis, he was a synthetic deity, a mishmash of Zeus and Hermes and Asclepios. So he was a savior deity. He could heal, he could resurrect, he could do everything. But he was a mishmash of different deities. And one of his aspects was Osiris. That's why he was a resurrection deity. And all these ideas are being explored in Rome at this time. And Christianity, early Christianity, should not be looked at as just one monolithic structure. They are probably dozens, if not scores, of different groups, all seeking in different ways a particular identity. And in fact, let me just do something quickly here, since I've got this screen up. This is a 3rd or 4th century image from a tomb, a Christian tomb, which shows Jesus as, looks like a sun deity. He could be Apollo. And that already shows you that there's a crossover here in terms of symbolism on how to portray this deity. Because before he was a teacher of wisdom, and now he's evolved into being a deity. In fact, the deity. And you can see here that he's got a quadriga, which is 4 horses, that's pulling along a chariot, and these symbols are normally associated with the sun. So these early Christians are trying to understand how to portray their deity, and they are borrowing quite openly images from other religions. There's no problem. And in the catacombs in Rome, you will often see symbols which are just as applicable to Jews as they are applicable to early nascent Christians, as they are applicable to other polytheists who are practicing other Greco-Roman religions. And just for an example, this is a Christian tomb in Rome, and Jesus is being portrayed as Orpheus. And Orpheus is a Greek semi-divine being who, if you know the myths, he was the only human being who managed to go down into Hades. He tried to release his loved, he had a loved one who was taken from him, and he went down into Hades and he played his music and sang his song and convinced Hades and Persephone to release his the object of his love and desire. And we call such a person a psychopomp. A psychopomp, for example, Hermes was a psychopomp. Hermes, who eventually became associated with the Roman god Mercury, the messenger of the gods. He was allowed to travel from Olympus all the way down into Hades. He was the only deity who could do that because he was a psychopomp. Now, under Christian teaching, Jesus comes down to earth, incarnate as a man. He dies as a guiltless man. He pays the price of sin. And while he is in the tomb, according to some of the traditions, he goes down into Hades and releases all the dead souls of all the people that went to Hades before he arrived. In other words, Jesus is acting as a psychopomp. And so how do you express that on your tomb? Well, you either use Hermes or you use Orpheus. And here we see Jesus as Orpheus. Now, this symbol would be recognized by a Christian at that time as being perfectly acceptable. And a non-Christian would also understand it because it has a universal application. Same goes for Jesus as a good shepherd. These early depictions of Jesus, he's got short hair, he's got no beard. He's shown as a Hermes. He's a psychopomp. And Hermes was also depicted carrying sheep and carrying goats, for example, on his shoulders. It is a universal symbol that crosses boundaries. And it illustrates very well the fact that Rome is a melting pot. It's a crucible within which you have various religions all developing and coexisting and swapping ideas and basically borrowing from each other. And I'll end with this. This is a marble bust, which is actually in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And if you know anything about art, in the 4th century, you will see that this is a very, it's basically the late antiquity. And it could be Jesus, it could be Zeus, either. Because by that time, the Christians are now modeling their deity on the original Greek idea of a mature man with a beard to show wisdom and authority. And Zeus has been borrowed now to portray Christ. And because the two religions are so closely aligned, it's actually very difficult to decide whether this is actually the head of Christ or the head of Zeus. And there are many other images like this that you can use to see that. So let me leave it there. And I'll stop the screen, and I hope I'm back on the screen now.
Yep, you are, and that was my closing question. So we don't have any super chat questions right now. So I think I'll just go ahead and end it right there. So thank you for joining me today, Nicholas.
It's a pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.